The chain rattled before I saw her face, and that sound is the reason I will never be the same woman again. I'd driven 2 hours with a cashier's check folded in my coat pocket and Cadillac paperwork on the passenger seat, humming along to the radio like a fool who still believed in surprises. My name is Marlena Sennett, 61 years old, and until that Thursday evening, I thought the biggest thing I'd ever given anyone was $150,000 and a car with the temporary tags still taped to the windshield. I let myself through the side gate the way I always had. Nobody answered when I called ahead, but the lights were on, gold and warm through the windows of the main house, gospel music, low under laughter. I remember thinking how good it was to hear my daughter's in-laws sounding happy. Then I heard the chain. The shed sat well back from the house, past a stretch of dark grass and a row of old pines, far enough that a scream out here would have to fight its way past 4 acres and a locked door before it ever reached anybody dancing inside. By the time I got around it, I'd already stopped breathing right. Chandra was on the concrete. 7 months along, a logging chain looped through a cinder block and locked around her ankle. One eye swollen shut, her wrists raw enough that I knew this wasn't the first night. She didn't cry out when she saw me. She just looked up, slow, like she wasn't sure I was real. If you're watching this and you've ever felt your whole body go cold at once, you already know there are no words for that first second. Drop where you're watching from tonight. I want to know I'm not alone in this. I got the spare key off her old key ring and broke that lock open with hands that weren't shaking anymore. Somewhere between finding her and lifting her off that concrete, I stopped being a mother who cries and became something else. I called it in from my phone, voice flat and clear, giving the dispatcher the address like I'd rehearsed it my whole life. The officers who came didn't take my word for anything. They knelt beside my daughter first, flashlight on the chain, on the bruising along her ribs, on the way her hand pressed instinctively over her stomach every time she flinched. One of them asked her name twice before she could answer. That was enough. That was more than enough. Inside, the party hadn't stopped. Through the window, I watched my son-in-law, Dorsey, laughing with a drink in his hand under a banner that said, "Happy Birthday, King." His mother Verna refilling a plate, his brother Elijah and sister Kiana dancing like the floor belonged to them, an aunt I didn't know clapping along. I walked to that door with the check still folded against my chest, and the officers a step behind me. Dorsey saw my face before he saw them. Whatever he'd planned to say died somewhere in his throat. "I came here bearing gifts," I said. "Instead, I'm going to make sure you never touch a dollar, a car, or my daughter again." The police are already on their way. They weren't on their way. They were already standing in that doorway with me. And within minutes, Dorsey had his hands cuffed behind his back, while his mother screamed his name into the night air. Verna, Elijah, Kiana, and the aunt were pulled aside and questioned one at a time on the lawn, not one of them in handcuffs yet, though I could see it in their eyes. They knew this wasn't over. A detective named Cedric Bonhomme was the one who finally came to me, notebook open, asking me to start from the beginning. I didn't know yet that the beginning wasn't the chain at all. The beginning was a signature my daughter never wrote, sitting in a bank file 3 counties away, waiting for someone to notice. The machines in that room made more sense to me than my own daughter's silence. They wheeled Chandra back within minutes of arriving, and I sat in a hallway chair too hard to be comfortable, listening to numbers being called out through a half-closed door. Heart rate, blood pressure, words I didn't understand stacked on top of words I didn't want to. A nurse came out once, quiet, professional. telling me they were monitoring the baby closely, and that everything being documented tonight would be filed as a mandatory report, whether I asked for that or not. I nodded like that made sense. Nothing made sense. When they finally let me sit with her, Chandra's hospital gown had slipped off one raw wrist, and she kept her arm angled away from me without seeming to notice she was doing it. Her eyes stayed on the ceiling. "Mama," she said, so low I leaned in without meaning to. I tried once. I didn't ask her what she meant. I already understood, the way a mother understands the shape of a sentence before it's finished. "Months ago," she said, "I had a bag packed. I got as far as the bus station in Selma." A monitor beside her chirped, sharp and sudden, and she flinched so hard her whole body curled inward before a nurse rushed in, checked the screen, adjusted something, and left again, without a word. Chandra didn't pick the sentence back up right away. She watched the door until it clicked shut. "Dorsey called his brother before I even got my ticket printed," she finally said. "Elijah was there before the bus was. Told the whole family I'd had a bad night. Told my own sister the same thing over the phone. And she believed him, because why wouldn't she?" My hands went cold around the blanket at the edge of her bed. "After that," she said, "he took the car in for something and it just never came back right. And my phone started doing things I couldn't explain. Calls that wouldn't go through. Messages that disappeared before I could read them twice. I thought about the last 8 months of half-answered calls. The way she'd stopped picking up on the third ring. The way I'd told myself she was just busy, just tired, just pregnant and private, the way some women get. I told myself that so many times I'd started to believe it. I hadn't asked the right questions. I'd let her silence sit there because it was easier than pushing. "I should have driven out here months ago," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. Chandra shook her head, slow, like even that cost her something. "You didn't know what he was." "I knew enough to wonder," I said. "I just didn't want it to be true." Her hand found mine on the blanket, cold fingers wrapping around mine like she was the one comforting me instead of the other way around. She opened her mouth like she had more to say, her breath catching in that particular way that meant the next sentence mattered. "There's something else," she started. "Something about the house. About papers. Dorsey had me." The door swung open. A doctor stepped in, chart in hand, asking to examine her again before shift change, and Chandra's sentence folded shut behind her teeth like she'd never started it at all. I sat back in that hard little chair, my daughter's unfinished words sitting heavier in that room than anything the monitors had said all night. I found out what Dorsey was calling my daughter's suffering 3 days later, from a stranger's voice on a recorded jailhouse line that Cedric Bonham played for me without warning. "She asked me to," Dorsey said, flat, rehearsed. "She said she felt like she was losing control of herself. I was protecting her." I sat across from Cedric's desk and didn't say anything for a long moment. He watched my face the way I imagine he watched 100 other faces before mine, waiting to see what kind of woman I was going to be about this. "His attorney's already floating it publicly," Cedric said. "Man named Wardle Pruitt. Called it a mental health accommodation gone wrong. Said your daughter has a documented history of anxiety and asked for restraint as a safety measure." "She has never asked anyone to chain her to a cinder block," I said, and my voice didn't rise even a note. "I believe you," Cedric said. "Doesn't mean a jury will, not without more than her word and yours." That evening, Verna gave an interview outside the courthouse, a scarf pulled tight around her neck, dabbing at eyes that didn't look wet to me. "My son loves that girl," she told the camera. "We were managing something private, something medical, the family way. Marlena wasn't there for the months before. She doesn't know what we were dealing with." I watched it twice. The first time, I felt something old and sharp rise up in my chest. The second time, I made myself sit very still until it passed, because underneath the anger was something I didn't expect to find. A small, cold question I couldn't quite silence. If I went after everything Dorsey had, if I didn't stop at keeping my daughter safe, but went all the way to taking his freedom, his money, his mother's house, his brother's business, was I still the wronged party? Or was I becoming something else? Something that wanted ruin for its own sake. I thought about Reginald, gone 11 years now, and what he used to say about people who mistook righteousness for revenge. I sat with that discomfort instead of pushing it away, because pushing things away was exactly what had gotten us here in the first place. Verna's scarf, her practiced tears, her use of the word medical like it was a shield. None of that was an accident. That was a woman building a story, brick by brick, in public, before anyone could ask her a single hard question in a courtroom. And I understood, watching her, that grief wasn't going to win this. Precision would. I want everything pulled, I told Cedric the next morning. Every call he made in the last year, every text, every dollar that moved through that house. That's a lot of ground, Cedric said. I have time, I said, and I intend to use every hour of it. Cedric made a note, then looked up at me with something between respect and warning. You understand, this isn't going to move fast. Some of what we find might not even touch the case against him directly. Pull it anyway, I said. He nodded slowly, already reaching for his phone to request the warrant. Behind him, taped to the corkboard, was a printout of Dorsey's SIL provider, and stapled to the back of it, half hidden, a second document with a bank's letterhead I hadn't been shown yet. I called the bank at 9 in the morning, and I made sure my voice didn't shake once. I need to formally stop payment on a cashier's check, I told the woman on the line, and I gave her every number she asked for, like I was reciting my own birth date. When she asked me the reason, I said only what was true and nothing more. It's no longer needed for its intended purpose. She didn't ask what the purpose had been. I was grateful for that small mercy. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long while, looking at the empty space on the counter where I'd laid the Cadillac paperwork out just 5 days earlier, admiring it like a fool admiring her own good intentions. I folded what was left of it into a drawer and didn't open that drawer again. 3 counties away, inside a jail visitation room that smelled like bleach and old coffee, Dorsey sat across from his brother with a phone pressed so hard to his ear the plastic left a mark. The payment, he said, low, urgent. Tell me it went through. Elijah's voice on the other end was careful, the way a man's voice gets when he already suspects the answer will make things worse. Dorsey, we're behind. We've been behind. I told you 2 months ago the numbers didn't add up without her check, Dorsey said, and something in his voice cracked open just slightly. The first real fear I would come to hear about secondhand, weeks later, when it no longer mattered what he was afraid of. That check isn't coming, Elijah said. You saw the news same as I did. Dorsey didn't answer that. He just sat there, according to the report that would later land on Cedric Bonhomme's desk, staring at a wall for 11 full seconds before hanging up without another word. None of that panic reached me directly. What reached me was smaller and stranger and came from an entirely different direction. A quarterly compliance review, the kind every bank runs on schedule, whether or not anyone's watching, whether or not a woman 2 counties over ever calls to cancel a check, flagged a missed mortgage payment on a property listed under Kennard Towing and Recovery, LLC. It wasn't drama. It wasn't a whistleblower or a tip. It was a spreadsheet doing exactly what spreadsheets do, at exactly the time it was scheduled to do it, landing in the queue of a compliance officer named Cassandra Rucker, who had no idea that Tuesday morning that she was about to become the second thread pulling a family apart. Cassandra opened the file the way she opened 40 others that week, tired, efficient, looking for numbers that didn't reconcile. She found one, a payment history with a gap that didn't match the loan's origination pattern. A property address she recognized, vaguely, from a local news segment she'd half-watched over dinner a few nights before. She sat back in her chair, opened a second window on her screen, and typed the property address into the county's public records search just to see what would come up. What came up was a name she hadn't expected to see twice in 1 week. Cassandra Rucker's referral landed on Augustine Winbush's desk with a sticky note that said only, "Signature looks off. Please advise." Augustine had spent 11 years reading documents for a living, and she knew the difference between a signature that simply varied day to day and one that had never come from the same hand twice. She pulled 3 notarized documents with Chandra's name on them, a car title, an old lease, a hospital consent form from years back, and laid them side by side under her desk lamp. The loop on the S didn't match. Not once. Not on any of them. Against the one on the mortgage file. She didn't call it luck when Cedric Bonhomme asked her about it later. "Luck is when you stumble on something," she told him. "This is what happens when somebody flags a missed payment and you actually look." She requested the full loan file that afternoon. $340,000, secured against the Kennard property, disbursed 11 weeks before I ever drove out with that check in my coat pocket. Money that hadn't gone toward the house at all. Money that had moved, in pieces, into an account belonging to Kennard Towing and Recovery, LLC. I learned all of this the same way I'd learned everything else that mattered lately. Sitting in a small room across from someone with a folder, waiting for the next thing to break open. Chandra was with me when Augustine laid it out. My daughter looked at the printed signature page the way a person looks at a photograph of a stranger wearing their own face. "That's not my handwriting," she said. Not loud, not shaking, just certain in the flat, worn-down way of someone who had learned months ago that certainty didn't always change anything. "We know," Augustine said gently. "That's why I'm here." Chandra kept staring at the page like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. "He put my name on a loan," she said, slower now, like she was teaching herself the sentence one word at a time. "For $340,000. And I didn't know." I sat there and felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with grief anymore. Because the check I'd brought, the $150,000 I'd saved for 11 months, sold timber rights for, cashed out a policy for, hadn't been a birthday gift Dorsey wanted. It was a patch he needed. A number small enough to quiet a missed payment before anyone with a badge or a spreadsheet ever looked twice. He hadn't been dancing in that house because he loved his birthday. He'd been dancing because he thought, by morning, my money would have already covered the gap, and no one would ever have to know what he'd already done in my daughter's name. He wasn't celebrating turning 34, I said quietly, mostly to myself. He was celebrating almost getting away with it. Augustine closed the folder, but didn't stand up yet. "There's one more thing," she said, choosing her words like she already knew how they'd land. "The account this money moved into, it isn't just his. There's a second name on it. Someone who signed off on the LLC's banking authority the same month this loan closed." Chandra's hand found mine again, the same cold grip from the hospital room, and I realized I was bracing for a name before Augustine even said it. The second name on that account belonged to Elijah, and by the time Cedric Bonhomme pulled into the tow lot to ask him about it, Elijah already had his answer rehearsed too smooth, to be honest. I signed what my brother put in front of me, Elijah said, wiping his hands on a rag that didn't need wiping. Family business. I don't read every line of every form. You don't read the line that puts your name on a bank authority for $340,000? Cedric asked, not unkindly, just patient in the way of a man who already knew the answer didn't matter yet. Elijah's jaw worked once before he answered. I trust my brother. You helped build that shed too, Cedric said, glancing past him toward the lot's back fence, though he wasn't asking a question yet, just letting the fact sit there between them. Elijah didn't say anything to that at all. That silence went into Cedric's notebook, the same as any word would have. I wasn't there for that conversation. I heard about it later, secondhand, the way I was starting to hear about most of what mattered. What I did see that same week was Kiana. She'd always been the one who texted me happy birthday on time, who'd sent Chandra baby name suggestions 2 months back like nothing in that house was wrong. Now, when I called to check on Chandra's things still sitting in that compound, Kiana's voice came through thin and careful. I don't really check the family group chat anymore, she said, before I'd even asked about it. It got to be a lot. A lot? How? I asked. A pause stretched long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. Just a lot, she said again. And I understood that some sentences aren't meant to be finished on the phone. Cedric was building something in the background none of us could see all at once. A timeline he laid across his desk with dates pulled from Chandra's hospital intake, from Elijah's construction supply receipts for the shed, from a burst of family texts 8 months back that all mentioned, in one careful phrasing or another, helping Chandra through a hard season. 8 months. That was how long the phrase had been circulating among people who loved her or claimed to. While my daughter was being fed a story none of them questioned hard enough to break. Cedric called me that evening, voice even, the way it always was when he had something heavy to hand me gently. The construction receipts on that shed date back 9 months, he said. Before that, there's nothing back there but an open dog run. Somebody built a structure around a decision, Mrs. Sennett. That doesn't happen in a single bad night. I sat with that a long moment, feeling the shape of it settle where the anger used to sit alone. Elijah's not under arrest, Cedric added. Not yet. But I wanted you to know we're not looking at Dorsey alone anymore. I thought of Kiana's thin voice, of the group chat she'd quietly left, of a woman who maybe knew more than she'd said, and maybe was already deciding, in her own private way, which side of this she wanted to be standing on when it was finally over. I didn't know yet that her decision would come from an entirely different phone, 3 weeks later, to someone she'd never expected the police to ask about at all. Kiana called her friend Renata at 11 at night, the way people call when they've been holding something too long to sleep with it anymore. I saw the chain in the shed back in the spring, she said, voice barely above a whisper, like the walls of her own apartment might repeat it back to someone. I told myself it was for the dog. We don't even have a dog anymore, Renata. Hadn't had one in a year. Renata didn't say anything for a moment. Did you tell anybody? Who was I supposed to tell? Kiana said. My brother? My mama, who thinks the sun rises out of Dorsey's mouth? She laughed, short and humorless. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself a lot of things. That conversation didn't stay between the two of them. Renata mentioned it, weeks later, to a detective canvassing the family's known contacts, and Kiana's name went into Cedric Bonhomme's file as someone who might know more than she'd said on the lawn that first night. But the account that changed the shape of the case entirely didn't come from Kiana at all. It came from a woman named Delphine Petway, who'd been Chandra's closest friend since community college, long before Dorsey ever came into the picture. Theodora Lassiter, newly assigned to prosecute the case, found her name buried in an old phone record, a number Chandra had called 4 times in a single week, 10 months before I ever drove out to that compound. Delphine sat across from Theodora with her hands folded tight in her lap. She called me crying, Delphine said. Said Dorsey had taken her keys again. Said she felt like she was being watched even when she was alone in a room. Did she ever describe any kind of mental health crisis? Theodora asked. Any episode, anything she wanted managed? Delphine's face went hard in a way that had nothing gentle left in it. She wasn't losing her mind, she said. She was scared of a man. Those aren't the same thing. And anybody who tells you different wasn't in that phone call with me. Theodora wrote that down word for word because she understood exactly what she was holding. An account that existed months before Wardell Pruitt's client ever uttered the phrase, "She asked me to," untouched by anyone's coaching, unconnected to anyone with something to gain. This matters, Theodora told Cedric later that week, spreading Delphine's statement beside the shed's construction timeline. Their story is that this was a crisis that started recently, something they were managing together as a family. Delphine's account puts real fear, using real words, 10 months before that she'd ever went up. Defense will say a friend's memory of a phone call isn't proof of anything, Cedric said. No, Theodora agreed, but it's a thread. And once you pull one thread on a story like theirs, the rest of it doesn't hold as tight as they think it does. I met Delphine myself only once, in the hallway outside Theodora's office, and she took my hand without a word of introduction needed. She used to talk about you all the time, Delphine said quietly. Said you'd have driven out there in a heartbeat if she'd ever let herself ask. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. What I did understand, standing in that hallway, was that my daughter's silence hadn't been an accident. And it hadn't been indifference on my part either. It had been built, brick, by people who knew exactly what they were doing long before I ever packed that check into my coat. Chandra wore a plain gray dress to the hearing, no jewelry, her hands folded in her lap the way I'd taught her to sit in church 30 years ago. And when Theodora Lassiter called her to the stand, I watched my daughter stand up like the floor might not hold her. It held her. Describe. In your own words, Theodora said gently, what happened the night before your husband's birthday? Chandra's voice came out steady, slower than I'd ever heard her speak. He told me I'd been talking to myself. Told me I scared him. The things I said in my sleep. He said it would only be for a few nights until I calmed down. She paused. I never asked to be chained to anything. I asked him to let me go inside. I asked him that every day. Wardell Pruitt rose slow, buttoning his jacket like he had all the time in the world. Mrs. Kennard, he said, isn't it true you'd previously discussed feeling overwhelmed with your husband? Overwhelmed enough to want some kind of intervention? I was overwhelmed, Chandra said, because I was afraid of him, not because I was losing my mind. But you used the word overwhelmed. His word or yours? Mine, she said, twisted into something it never meant. Wardell let that sit a beat too long, the way a man does when he wants a jury, or, in this case, a judge, to keep chewing on a word after the witness has already answered it. And isn't it also true, he continued, that you told a nurse the night you were admitted that you didn't know what was real anymore? I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't heard that detail before, and from the way Chandra's jaw tightened, neither had she expected it raised like that, cold and out of context. I said that, Chandra admitted, because I'd just been found chained outside in the dark, 7 months pregnant. And for 1 second, I didn't know if I was hallucinating my own rescue. That's not the same thing as losing my mind for months. That's what shock sounds like. Wardell nodded slowly, letting the ambiguity hang a moment longer before finally sitting down, satisfied he'd planted at least one seed of doubt into the record. Judge Alton Meacham said nothing for a long moment after both sides rested, flipping back through pages of his own notes with a deliberateness that made the whole courtroom hold its breath. I watched Chandra's hands, still folded, knuckles gone pale. "This court finds sufficient probable cause exists," Meacham finally said, "for the matter to proceed to trial on all charges as filed. Bail remains denied, given the severity of the injuries and the ongoing risk to the victim." It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't over. But it was enough air to breathe for one more stretch of road. Outside the courthouse, Chandra didn't cry the way I expected her to. She stood very still on the steps, looking out at nothing in particular. "I used to think if I ever got the chance to say it out loud, I'd fall apart," she said. I didn't fall apart. I felt something in my own chest settle differently than it had in weeks, less like fury looking for somewhere to land, more like a woman quietly counting exactly what she still needed to gather before the next room, the next hearing, the next fight. "No," I said. "You didn't." Behind us, through the courthouse doors, I caught a glimpse of Wardell Pruitt on his phone, jaw tight, already dialing someone before the doors even swung shut. Augustine Winbush laid the money trail out on a conference table the way some women lay out a quilt, square by square until the whole pattern showed itself at once. $340,000 disbursed, she said, sliding a page toward Theodora Lassiter. 190 of it moved within 6 days into the operating account for Kennard Towing and Recovery. From there, it paid down 2 overdue equipment loans and covered 11 weeks of payroll that the business couldn't otherwise have made. "And the rest?" Theodora asked. "Sitting in a separate holding account," Augustine said, "untouched. Like somebody was saving it for something bigger, or hadn't decided yet what to do with it before all this happened." Theodora looked up. "That holding account. Whose signature authorizes withdrawals?" "Same as the banking authority on the original loan," Augustine said. "Dorsey and Elijah." That was the sentence that ended things for Elijah, though he didn't hear it from either of them. He heard it from Cedric Bonham, standing in the same tow lot where he'd once wiped his hands on a rag and said he trusted his brother. "Elijah Kennard," Cedric said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and unlawful use of a forged instrument." Elijah didn't fight the cuffs. He stood very still, staring at the shed roof line in the distance like he was memorizing it, the way a man looks at something he suspects he won't get to keep much longer. Verna found out from a phone call, standing in her kitchen with a pot still on the stove. And I know this because Cedric described her voice to me afterward, flat with something between disbelief and math being done too fast. "The house," she said. "Tell me this doesn't touch the house." "Mrs. Kennard," the officer on the line said, "the property is listed as collateral on the loan in question. Until this resolves, there's a lien against it. And given your ownership stake, you may be named in a related civil action." Verna didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost to herself, "I signed papers for that boy for 30 years. I never once thought to read what I was signing." I understood something, hearing that secondhand, that I hadn't fully let myself feel before. Verna wasn't a mastermind. She was something more familiar and, in its own way, sadder. A woman who had spent so long protecting her son by instinct that she'd never once stopped to ask what exactly she was protecting him from doing. That didn't make her innocent. It made her complicit in the particular way people become complicit without ever deciding to be. One signed form at a time, one averted glance at a time, until the distance between not knowing and not wanting to know closed to nothing at all. I thought of my own silence with Chandra's unanswered calls, and for one unwelcome second, I saw something of myself in that kitchen with Verna, before I made myself remember the difference. I had wondered. She had built a shed. Theodora called that evening with an update, her voice carrying the particular energy of a woman who just watched a case gain real weight. Elijah's attorney's already reaching out, she said. Wants to discuss a plea. Might be willing to testify against Dorsey if it means less time. I sat with that news a long moment, feeling the shape of the whole compound. The land, the shed, the LLC, the family's whole claim to standing in that town, beginning finally to come apart at its seams. Let him talk, I said. Let's hear exactly how much he knows. Theodora Lassiter called me at 7 in the morning, and I knew before she said a word that whatever this was, it wasn't good news dressed up carefully. Her voice had a controlled evenness to it that I'd learned over the last several weeks, meant she was working hard to keep something steadier than she felt. Wardle filed a motion to exclude Delphine's statement, she said. Most of it. He's arguing it's hearsay, that Delphine repeating what Chandra told her on the phone months before any of this doesn't meet the exception standard without Chandra herself testifying to those same specific words. Chandra already testified, I said. Not to those specific calls, Theodora said. Not yet. And the judge sided with him on the bulk of it this morning. Delphine's account of what Chandra said to her directly is mostly excluded. Delphine can still testify to what she personally observed, Chandra's fear, her behavior, her physical state during those calls, but not to repeating her exact words as proof of the abuse timeline. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd once laid out Cadillac paperwork, like a woman who still believed gifts were simple things. So, the 10 months, I said. The part that proves this didn't start with some sudden episode. Weaker, Theodora admitted. Not gone, but weaker than it was yesterday. For the first time since that night at the compound, I felt something close to real fear settle into my chest. Not the sharp, immediate fear of finding my daughter chained to a cinder block, but a slower, colder kind. The fear of watching something I'd been so sure of start to slip through fingers that had held it tightly for weeks. What do we do? I asked, and I noticed my own voice had lost its usual steadiness. We stop relying on what people said, Theodora said, and we lean harder into what the evidence itself can prove without needing anyone's memory to carry it. I could hear papers shifting on her end of the line. The shed's construction timeline stands on its own. Permits, receipts, dates. None of that needs Delphine to say a word. The medical records from that first night stand on their own. And Elijah's starting to talk. If his account lines up with the timeline, it doesn't need to pass through hearsay rules the same way. He's a party to the case, not a friend repeating gossip. And if Elijah changes his mind, I said. If his lawyer decides silence serves him better. Theodora didn't answer that right away, and her silence told me more than reassurance would have. I sat alone in that kitchen a long while after we hung up, staring at nothing, feeling for the first time since the night I broke that chain open, that this might not go the way I'd been so certain it would. I thought of Wardle's calm, practiced hands buttoning his jacket in that courtroom, of Verna's rehearsed grief on the courthouse steps, of how easily a story could be reshaped in front of people whose job was only to weigh what they were allowed to hear. I thought, too, of Chandra, who had already stood up once and found her voice, not knowing that voice might now need to carry weight it hadn't been asked to carry before. I picked up my phone and called Theodora back before she'd even had time to set hers down. Tell me exactly what Chandra needs to say, I said. so this doesn't fall apart on a technicality no jury will ever understand. The forensic team finished pulling Dorsey's seized phone on a Tuesday, and Cedric Bonhomme was the one who found the thread that made him sit back from his own desk and read it twice before saying a word to anyone. Messages, going back 8 months, between Dorsey and a records clerk named Marquis Tolliver, who happened to be a cousin on his mother's side and happened to work 3 desks down from the evidence room at the sheriff's office. They flagged your name for a welfare check request last spring, one message read. I buried it under a duplicate filing. Nobody followed up. Another, more recent, sent the same week Marlena had frozen the check. Detective. Pulling your financials hard. Whatever you're moving, move it faster. Cedric read that last one 3 times. He didn't confront Marquise directly. He walked it quietly to his captain first, and by the end of that day, Internal Affairs had opened its own file, separate from the case against Dorsey, separate from the fraud investigation, a 3rd thread running parallel to the first 2. He's suspended pending investigation, Cedric told me over the phone, and I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not quite anger, but a kind of tired disappointment in his own house. The welfare check request came from Delphine back in the spring, after Chandra went quiet on her for a few weeks. She did the right thing calling it in. If that call had gone through the way it should have, somebody might have knocked on that door 8 months before you ever did. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with Dorsey or Verna or Elijah at all. 8 months, I repeated. I know, Cedric said. I trusted that if somebody official ever looked, I said, they'd have seen something. I didn't know I was trusting a system that had a hole in it the whole time. You're not wrong to feel that, Cedric said. But I need you to hear the other half of this too. That leak didn't stop the case. It didn't stop us. It just meant it took longer, and it meant we can't count on any one channel doing its job the way it's supposed to. I understood, sitting there, that the anger I'd been carrying toward one family now had a second target, quieter and harder to name. A system I'd assumed would simply work, the way I'd assumed for years that a phone left unanswered was nothing more than a daughter being busy. Then we don't rely on it, I said. Not on Marquise, not on anybody's good faith. Every piece of this case needs to stand on paper that can't be buried, can't be lost, can't depend on one person deciding to do their job. Cedric was quiet for a moment. That's exactly the approach Theodora's already building toward, he said. Receipts, records, timestamps, things a cousin in the wrong office can't make disappear. I thanked him and hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table a long while, thinking of all the ways a family protects its own. A mother's practiced tears on a courthouse step, a brother's silence about a shed, a cousin quietly burying a call that should have saved my daughter 8 months sooner. I thought of Chandra's voice in that hospital bed, cut short before she could finish a sentence about papers Dorsey had made her sign. Whatever was left to uncover, I decided. I wasn't going to wait for anyone else to find it for me. Chandra's labor started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 9 weeks after the night I broke that chain open, and nothing about it felt ordinary once it began. I sat beside her hospital bed the way I had that first terrible night, except this time her hand gripped mine out of pain instead of fear, and the machines around us were counting down towards something that mattered instead of something that frightened us. You're doing this? I told her, and she managed something close to a laugh between contractions. I know, she said. Believe me, I know. Her son was born just after 8 that evening, small and furious and perfect, and when the nurse laid him against Chandra's chest, I watched my daughter's face do something I hadn't seen it do in 9 weeks. Go soft, unguarded, entirely hers again. He's got your stubborn chin, I told her, and she laughed for real that time, tears mixing into it without any fear attached to them at all. I didn't let myself think about Dorsey once. Not in that room. Not that night. He found out from his attorney the next morning, and Wardell Pruitt wasted no time. By that afternoon, a petition for supervised visitation had been filed on Dorsey's behalf, citing his rights as the child's biological father, currently presumed innocent, currently entitled under the law to some measure of access regardless of pending charges. Theodora Lassiter called me that evening, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone managing 2 fights at once. "He can't get unsupervised access," she said. "Not with the charges pending, but Wardell's arguing for supervised visits starting soon, and family court doesn't always move at the same pace or with the same information as a criminal case." "He chained her to a cinder block," I said. 7 months pregnant. "I know," Theodora said. "And I'm going to make sure the judge knows it in detail, every piece of evidence we have, before he's within 100 feet of that baby unsupervised. But I want you prepared. This is its own battle now. Different courtroom, different judge, different rules." I thought about the 8 months it had already taken to get this far. The staggered arrests, the hearsay ruling that had shaken my confidence to its core, Marcus Tolliver's buried welfare check, Elijah's still undecided plea. This was not, I understood now, a single fight with a single ending. It was several fights, running at once, each with its own timeline and its own way of trying to fail us. "Then we fight that one too," I said. "Same as all the others. On paper, with evidence, without waiting for anyone's good faith to carry us." Theodora was quiet a moment. "I like that you keep saying that," she said, "because it's exactly right." That night, back in the hospital room, I held my grandson while Chandra finally slept, his weight small and solid against my arm, and I found myself making him a promise I intended to keep with the same patience I'd learned to apply to everything else in the months since that chain. Somewhere in a jail 3 counties over, I imagined Dorsey hearing the news of his son's birth from a lawyer's mouth instead of a nurse's. And for the first time since that night at the compound, I let myself feel something close to satisfaction rather than grief. It didn't last long. Theodora's next call came 2 days later, and this time her voice had no patience left in it at all. Theodora's tense call 2 days after the birth turned out to be about the hearing date, moved up sooner than any of us expected. And I understood before she finished explaining that Wardell had pushed for speed on purpose. "He wants this decided before the criminal trial," Theodora said. "Before Elijah's plea situation resolves, before the full weight of the fraud case is public record. He's betting a family court judge, moving fast, might weigh pending and unproven more gently than a judge who's seen the whole picture. Family court smelled different than criminal court. Softer carpet, quieter voices, but Wardell Pruitt buttoned his jacket the same deliberate way he had every time before. "Your Honor," he said, "my client has not been convicted of anything. Under the law, he remains entitled to a relationship with his son, supervised or otherwise, and an emergency order stripping him of all access risks, punishing a man for accusations still working their way through the courts." Judge Alton Meacham didn't respond right away. He turned instead to the folder in front of him. Thick now. The same folder that had grown heavier every week since the night I broke that chain open. "Ms. Lassiter," he said, "I understand you have something to submit regarding the pending criminal matter." Theodora stood. "Your Honor, I'd ask the court to consider the totality of the evidentiary record, medical documentation from the night of the arrest, the construction timeline on the restraint structure predating that night by 9 months, and the sworn account of the child's mother regarding an ongoing pattern of confinement and control." "Objection," Wardell said. "None of that has been proven beyond reasonable doubt in a criminal proceeding." "This isn't a criminal proceeding," Meacham said, not unkindly, but with a finality that made the room go still. "This is a determination of the best interest of a child. The standard here is not reasonable doubt, Mr. Pruitt. It's risk." Wardle's jaw tightened, the first crack I'd seen in his composure since that very first courtroom. Meacham looked down at his notes a long moment before speaking again. "Given the documented history, the pending felony charges, and the nature of the allegations, this court finds sufficient risk to the child's safety to grant the mother sole physical and legal custody at this time. Any future petition for visitation will require supervised conditions and will be revisited only pending resolution of the criminal matter." Chandra didn't cry out or gasp. She simply exhaled, slow, like she'd been holding that breath since the day her son was born. Outside, on the courthouse steps, she turned to me with something in her face I hadn't seen since before any of this began. Not relief exactly, but a kind of ownership over her own life, settling back into place. "He can't just show up," she said, testing the sentence like she needed to hear herself say it out loud. "Not without a judge saying so first." "Not without a judge saying so first," I repeated. I thought, standing there, of the night in Cedric's office months ago when I'd sat with a small, cold question I couldn't silence, whether pursuing everything made me no better than the people I was pursuing. I understood now, watching my daughter breathe easy on those steps, that the question had answered itself somewhere along the way. This wasn't vengeance. This was a wall built one brick of evidence at a time, and it had held exactly when it needed to. Wardell passed us on his way to his car, phone already at his ear, voice low and clipped. I only caught 4 words before he was out of earshot. "We need the trial moved." Almost a year to the day since I broke that chain open, I sat in a courtroom gallery and watched the case finally stand or fall on its own weight. Theodora Lassiter didn't lean on Delphine's excluded words anymore. She built the morning out of things no ruling could touch. Medical records from that first night. The shed's construction permits dated 9 months. Before the arrest, Augustine Winbush's paper trail tracing every dollar of that forged loan into an account with 2 names on it. Then she called Kayana. I hadn't expected her voice to shake as much as it did walking to the stand. Hadn't expected her to look everywhere in that room except at her brother. "Ms. Kennard?" Theodora asked. "Did you know your brother had constructed a restraint structure behind the family shed?" "I saw it going up," Kayana said. "Months before anything happened. I asked what it was for. Dorsey said it was for storage." "Did you believe him?" Kayana's hands twisted together in her lap. "No," she said, quiet but clear enough to carry. "I didn't want to know bad enough to ask twice." Wardle rose for cross, but something in his rhythm had changed. Slower now, less certain of the room. "You never reported any concern to authorities, did you?" "No," Kayana said. "So by your own admission, you have no direct knowledge that this structure was used for anything but storage, as your brother claims." Kayana looked at him for a long moment, then past him, toward the family who'd raised her to protect its own silence above everything else. "I heard the chain," she said. "More than once. I told myself I hadn't." The room went still in a way that no objection could undo. Wardle sat down without another question. Dorsey testified last, and I watched him lean into the same story his mother had told on the courthouse steps a year earlier. An episode, a crisis, a wife who'd asked for help managing something private. But Theodora walked him, patient and precise, through 9 months of construction permits, through a hospital record documenting shock and injury, consistent with prolonged restraint, through a signature that had never once matched his wife's hand on any other document in the county's files. "Mr. Kennard," she said, "if this was a mutual, medically informed arrangement, why does your business partner's signature appear on the loan you used to fund it, 3 months before your wife ever agreed to anything you've described?" Dorsey didn't answer that question. He looked instead toward Verna, sitting rigid in the second row, and said nothing at all. The jury took less than 6 hours. Guilty on domestic violence in the first degree. Guilty on unlawful imprisonment. The forgery and grand theft charges, tried separately given their financial complexity, would follow in a hearing already scheduled for the following month. But Augustine's evidence had already done its quiet work. Elijah's earlier plea agreement now folded neatly into the record against his brother, and a civil filing already prepared naming Verna as a co-liable party given her ownership stake in the collateralized property. Judge Meacham set sentencing for 6 weeks out. Dorsey didn't look at me as they led him from the courtroom. He looked instead toward the empty seat where his mother had been sitting only moments before, because Verna had already stood, quietly, and walked out the side door before the verdict was even fully read. I sat in that gallery a long moment after everyone else had gone, thinking of a compound with gold light in its windows, a banner that said, "Happy Birthday, King," and a woman who'd walked in bearing gifts and walked out instead with the only thing that had ever mattered. The civil judgment came down 8 weeks after sentencing, and Augustine Winbush was the one who called to walk me through it, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone closing a file she'd worked hard to fill. The court found Verna Kennard jointly liable for the fraudulent loan given her ownership stake and knowledge of the property's use, she said. Kennard Towing and Recovery's assets are being liquidated to satisfy the judgment. The compound itself goes into forced sale, proceeds first to the bank, remainder into a restitution fund for your daughter. I sat with that a long moment, not triumphant exactly, just still. Dorsey got 22 years on the domestic violence and unlawful imprisonment counts, Augustine continued. Additional time on the forgery and grand theft charges to run consecutively. Elijah's cooperation earned him 5, with parole eligibility. Verna avoided criminal charges herself. Prosecutors could prove she benefited and looked away, but not that she directed any of it. And the law draws that line hard. The civil judgment took nearly everything she had, left standing in her name instead. As for Marquis, Internal Affairs confirmed he was terminated and separately charged with obstruction. That badge won't protect anybody again. I thanked her and sat in my kitchen a long while after we hung up, in the same chair where I'd once folded away Cadillac paperwork I couldn't look at anymore. 11 months I'd spent saving for a gift I believed would buy my family peace. I thought about the timber rights I'd sold, the policy I'd cashed out, the quiet pride I'd felt driving out to that compound with a check folded against my chest, like it was the kindest thing I'd ever done. I understood now that peace was never something you could hand a man like Dorsey. It was something you had to build, patiently, on paper, whether he agreed to it or not. I thought, too, of the cold question that had sat with me since the night Verna gave her first interview outside the courthouse. Whether pursuing everything made me no different from the people I was pursuing. I knew the answer now. The way you know a thing, not because someone told you, but because you lived long enough inside the question to find its edges. Vengeance wants a man to suffer for its own sake. What I'd wanted was for my daughter to never again wonder if the people meant to protect her would choose comfort over her safety. Those were never the same thing. No matter how similar they'd once felt, sitting alone in my kitchen at midnight. Chandra called that evening, her son's voice babbling somewhere close to the phone. They're listing the property this week, she said. I drove past it yesterday. Didn't mean to. Just ended up on that road. How did it look? I asked. Empty, she said. Real empty. Sign out front already. A pause, softer than I expected. I didn't feel what I thought I'd feel. What did you feel? Done, she said. Just done, like a door finally closing all the way instead of hanging open a crack. I understood that completely. Weeks later, I drove out that same road myself, past the chain link fence and the for sale sign leaning slightly in the grass, past the shed where a logging chain no longer hung from anything at all. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't need to. I thought of the woman who'd driven this road 11 months ago, humming along to the radio, believing the biggest thing she'd ever give her family was a car and a check. I understood now what I'd actually given her. Not gifts, never gifts again, but a daughter standing on her own 2 feet, a grandson who would grow up never knowing what that shed had once held, and a piece I'd built myself, brick by brick, exactly the way it needed to be built. I turned the car around and drove home.